Hello, I'm David Schlegel. This presentation, as you can tell, is on natural disasters and mental health counseling. We'll start by looking at some general conditions associated with natural disasters. From there, we'll look at cultural implications that a counselor might experience in working with survivors. From there, we'll look at general assessment and intervention tasks, particularly those outlined in our textbook. Then we'll break into more specific conditions and situations associated with disasters and survivors. So let's look at a definition. From the Department of Homeland Security, I'll just read this one. Natural disasters include all types of severe weather that have the potential to pose a significant threat to human health and safety, property, and critical infrastructure. Okay. In short, natural disasters, as it will be applied in this presentation, are probably just what you're thinking. And some of the main ones are flood, fire, tornado, hurricane, and earthquake. And you know what's interesting is if you start to break this down even further, is that nearly all natural disasters, or at least 90% really, it says, have are impacted by flooding. You know, we have regular flood, I guess you could say, is listed here, which is just rising waters from a river or other body of water. But if you think about some of these other natural disasters listed here, they often bring about flooding conditions. Some of the most severe damage from an earthquake is the storm surge or the flood that happens after the storm. Obviously, earthquakes can bring about flooding, as can tornadoes and even fire in some situations. So flooding is the big one that we have to deal with. If we look here at the number of recorded natural disasters globally from 1900 to 2023, we can see a big spike in the number of occurrences after the 1960s. And this can be attributed to several things. I think that the most significant factor for this rise is reporting mechanisms. We just through technology and other means, we were more aware of natural disasters. We're able to report and record those events um, more significantly after the 1960s. You know, another implication that I'm not going to get into here, but cannot be discounted for this rise in events is climate change. So a variety of factors, but it's kind of interesting to see what's happening globally in terms of natural disaster events. We'll look now at the United States, and this is from statistics from 2022, as you can see, and you can see events, natural disaster events, total cost financially, and deaths associated with these events. And some of these categories and statistics get a little blurry, but you can see where hurricane is ahead of the pack in terms of the financial impact that these events have had, as well as the number of deaths that have occurred within or because of those types of natural disasters. How do natural disasters affect mental health? Well, it comes in a variety of different ways, but some of the most common ways, and we're going to get into this in more detail later, but there's initial shock and grief associated with the events because oftentimes there's little or no warning when these happen. There's mild stress, perhaps insomnia initially. Um, we can see an increased alcohol use, and this comes in the area of inappropriate coping skills, and we'll talk more about that later. Depression sometimes is not really apparent until long after the event, may not be a presenting problem. The same with anxiety, although we probably would see anxiety early on, maybe a bit more so than depression. And of course, post-traumatic stress, which may be revealed later in more detail, but often that's present as well. Of course, with all of these situations that may occur, they're individualized. And if we look at the model presented in our text, the ABCX model, we have the precipitating event or situation represented by A, and then how individuals, if you will, interact with that event through B, family and community resources, and then C, perceptions through the individual lens, family lens, and the community lens, all those actions working together that result in X, and that is the degree of stress associated with the crisis. So this is a great model, and I know everyone's familiar with this from our textbook, but it applies to all crisis situations. And of course, natural disasters are right there with that as well. Let's look at the impact on social systems. And disasters not only affect psychology, health of individuals, but also entire communities as well, depending on the severity and the breadth of the natural disaster. That then can lead to kind of a secondary wave, if you will, of distress that individuals may experience. Initially on their own through property damage, death, or injury, and then from a sense of community impact or community loss as well. Some cultural implications to think about. You know, survivors, a quote from one of the resources, survivors react to and recover from disaster within the context of their individual racial, ethnic backgrounds, cultural viewpoints, life experience, etc. This connects to the ABCX model that we just looked at, but it plays out in a different way. And I'd like to kind of break that down a little in more detail. So let's look at some cultural implications, particularly through a social and historical lens. When we look at the importance of community, the sense of loss may be more profound than what is experienced on the individual level. Sometimes entire communities are lost, like in a flood situation. This can lead to grief and trauma on multiple levels. There's a flip side to that as well, and that is this phenomenon of a disaster bringing communities more tightly together through the shared experience and a commitment to rebuild. Historical discrimination leads to often to widespread feelings of distrust, and this can impact survivors' willingness to seek and receive help from outsiders coming into a situation. Then also economic inequality is a significant cultural implication here. Often the poorest individuals live in the most vulnerable dwellings and areas, and they're often minimally insured. This can lead to more significant loss. Additionally, lower socioeconomic individuals may be less adept at navigating social systems and even filling out forms. However, again, another side to that coin, um, a lot of lower income individuals may exhibit greater coping skills after disaster because they've seen challenging times similar to this before. So two sides to look at that. Next, we'll look at some implications on working with diverse populations, and we'll break down just a few of these. And this we can look at if a volunteer disaster counselor maybe goes to another country or even an area within the U.S. where there's different barriers that can really hinder the helping relationship. And this can manifest in different forms. Let's look at communication. Obviously, language barriers might exist when survivors and workers are from different countries. And this can impact verbal and non-verbal communication. And it can make both parties feel alienated and unheard, and might lead to frustration. Personal space that's individually defined, culture bound as well, and natural disasters can impact this. And normal personal boundaries can be changed or diminished, and this can lead to stress. That's obviously, we know personal space is an issue to be considered in working with diverse populations, but then when you throw in the fact that a natural disaster may alter that, it's even a more significant implication. Beliefs, values, and attitudes are reinforced through social interactions. Natural disasters impact these interactions. Counselors can gain insight into the social impact of disasters by simply asking survivors, what are your personal interests? What are your hobbies? And if those alternatives are diminished and no longer exist, then that's going to impact their social well-being, which obviously impacts their well-being in general. Different cultures view time differently. We know that. We Americans, we typically view time as as clock time, specific intervals and specific durations. Other cultures, though, may look at time more broadly, like dinner time, worship time, or a harvest time. And time perceptions are often altered after a natural disaster. So this can impact individuals in different ways depending on their initial perception and interpretation of time. So this can cause frustration. Environmental control, this really relates to the way an individual views the reason or cause of a natural disaster, and this will impact their acceptance of help. For instance, if a person views a natural disaster as a vengeful act of God, they may feel that they deserve it and they deserve what they get, and they may be reluctant for help. Counselors should assess these views in order to tailor the way assistance is offered. And then related to this, counselors should develop an understanding of how survivors view religion and spirituality in relation to the potential cause of the disaster, as well as how this impacts help and how they will receive help. Prayer and other observances and rituals may be appropriate given the situation and how the client and counselor view that. Let's move now into essential assessment tasks. And this is from our text, and we're familiar with this, and this was outlined in a way that pertains to really all crisis situations. And some of these tasks and steps don't fit as neatly in response to natural disasters, and we'll look at that and discuss that. Step one is the need to address safety, stabilization, and risk. Safety is always the most important concern in assessing a crisis situation. And this assessment should be conducted at various times throughout the event, not just at the beginning, because it's going to change after time. And with a natural disaster, how one is experiencing their own personal safety and their situation will change, will evolve over time. Obviously, there should be special attention given to the level and degree of lethality or the willingness, desire to harm self or others. If this exists or exists at a high degree, obviously that will take precedence over anything else. And as a counselor and survivor explore the degrees of lethality, if this is done, as I'm sure it would be, in a compassionate way, that can actually strengthen the therapeutic relationship, even as short term as it may be. Step two, the holistic approach. Crisis counseling involves conducting a thorough assessment of the client in an attempt to gain an understanding of baseline functioning. Like many common assessment and intervention tasks with clients in crisis, responding to survivors of a natural disaster is often complicated by time restrictions. You don't have a lot of time to work with clients and slowly develop these types of understandings, but it's still important to try to develop an understanding of normal baseline functioning. And we'll walk through the ABCDE approach to this. Affect, how does the client present during the initial assessment? And this is the same as any other type of assessment during an initial session, and that includes looking at communication patterns, verbal and nonverbal, as well as a general demeanor. Behaviors B, since the precipitating event, what has the client done or not done in response to the event, and what resources have been accessed? Have sleeping and eating patterns been interrupted, etc.? Again, if this is an in-the-field assessment after a natural disaster, it's quite normal that these types of disruptions will be in place. C is for cognitions. Are there apparent distortions and deficiencies in a person's thinking? For example, does a survivor believe that conditions will just magically be restored? This is also another opportunity to assess the presence or levels of any lethality that might exist in the survivor. D, development. This is related to cognitions, and it pertains to how the client is functioning from an expected developmental level. This can be difficult to assess without prior knowledge of the client's normal functioning. Environment, here the counselor should try to get a handle on normal environmental, cultural, social, and religious supports that the client would normally lean on in a crisis situation and determine if these are viable. Step three is to clarify the problem. Survivors presenting problem may not be the actual problem. This can be especially true in response to a disaster situation. For instance, a survivor may present stress over the destruction of his or her home after a tornado, which would be very expected. But after digging deeper, it may be realized that the true problem is a greater sense of loss connected to more of a cultural loss. And this could be the result of an entire community being destroyed. I'm having a little recording problems there. Bear with me. The fourth step in the assessment task is exploring coping skills, resources, and supports. On this step, the counselor helps the client identify resources, coping skills, and resources that were successfully used in previous crisis episodes. Here, not only are existing strengths identified, which is important for a lot of reasons, but so are possible strategies to use in the current situation. Now we'll move on to intervention tasks. Again, taken right from our book, and these are going to be familiar to you. Uh, Number one is normalize and educate. Clients will likely be overwhelmed and that situations are out of their control. That's a natural feeling. They may be anxious, just about their anxiousness and uncomfortable with the flood of feelings and emotions that they are experiencing because this may be new. They may be pretty stable most of the time. Again, it's important to assess levels of lethality. Does the person seem like they're going to harm themselves or others? And if that's not in place to a significant degree, at least, then it's important to help the client understand that what they're experiencing is normal, as uncomfortable as it may be, and just educate them on what to expect from that. Moving on to step two, that's exploring option and using information collected in the assessment phase. The counselor and client should explore options. In the case of a natural disaster response, this may involve reviewing available and needed resources. In some cases, a counselor may need to be more directive than normal if the client is frozen with their anxiety. And then moving on then to step three, developing a plan and obtaining a commitment. Considering all the information available up to this point, a plan is collaboratively created. The plan should include risk factors and steps should be prioritized based on individual need and those available resources. And finally, the fourth intervention step, and this one is more difficult to apply, I think, to natural disaster responses, uh, but this is to prepare documentation, follow up, and provide referrals. I think in a lot of cases, looking at an in the field intervention approach for a natural disaster survivor, the follow up may be the most that can be done. Referrals options may not be available. You're really not going to be able to prepare a lot of documentation for closure. So you're just going to do the best you can, and that might be just how are we going to follow up on this. Let's move on and look at some typical natural disaster sources of stress. And this is what you might expect. Often survivors are living in a shelter for long or short periods of time, and this creates stressful conditions. Just the lack of privacy, that wouldn't be fun. And then the phenomenon of being isolated in groups. You may not be with family and friends, but yet you're with many others, and just that whole living situation is likely going to create stress. Maybe there's an inability to locate family members. This is going to cause confusion and uncertainty and a lot of stress, just not knowing. Now, there could be a loss of medication, likely, and medical equipment. And this is going to lead to not only physical complications if an individual is going without needed medication, but then the emotional stress of when am I going to get it? Am I ever going to get it? And what's this going to lead to? And the same goes with medical equipment that may be lost. Another source of guilt could be source of stress rather could be grief and guilt. Maybe the thoughts that you didn't provide the proper safety for your loved ones, or you overlooked details that you shouldn't have that might have prevented them from being injured, lost, or even killed. The loss of property and heirlooms is a source of stress. Obviously, the loss of property is going to bring with it a lot of financial stress as well. the unknown. Do I have good insurance or not? We're about to find out. And then heirlooms and priceless items that cannot be replaced is going to be a source of stress. And lost pets. Some of us have pets that we're very close to, and that is very stressful. If they're lost and their whereabouts are unknown, or if you know they were killed, that's high stress too, not to be overlooked. Now let's look at some mental health concerns connected to these stressors. Often there may be initial shock, and that's going to be very common. What you might not be able to get a handle on initially is, to what degree is this shock debilitating to the survivor? They may not be able to think clearly. Again, as I stated earlier, it's important to normalize these reactions and just help the person get through it, because oftentimes this initial shock wave passes, and that's when you can really begin to assess how that individual is functioning. Depression is going to be present, probably more so after the event, later, I should say, and not immediately, whereas anxiety is often present right away. How am I going to do this? When am I going to get that? And all that. So that's going to lead to anxiety. And then, I separated poor coping conditions because this is something that needs to be paid close attention to. And that is, do we see the presence of poor coping conditions in the individual? It's going to be difficult to cope, but are we seeing an increased use of drugs or alcohol, perhaps fighting, aggressive behavior between survivors, hoarding behavior, different things along those lines are telltale signs of a situation where individuals are not doing well. Let's look at the role of the counselor. Um, it's important to know that a counselor in a natural disaster response situation is probably going to act in ways not traditionally associated with the counselor, potentially, maybe more as a first responder. And this could be asked to do things like delivering supplies, directing traffic, maybe setting up temporary shelters, because everyone's it's all hands on deck in a crisis situation in response to a natural disaster. Definitely, counselors should be very knowledgeable on resources, what's available now, what's expected, what's needed. This is going to be ever changing too, because as you work with individuals, again, as we move on to ensure basic needs, it's going to be important that we can direct individuals to where they can meet all needs, and mostly those basic needs that I've included as a hierarchy of needs here. And it's also important that we understand individual, family, and community implications. This is going to vary per individual, but it's going to impact their ability to cope, adapt, and recover from that situation. How does all this impact a counselor? Well, it does, as you might guess. It's a stressful situation usually. Counselors if they're on the ground and responding to mental health needs, shortly after a disaster, there's going to be rapid fire clients coming at them in short succession. It's not going to be a casual, sit down and relax in my office kind of session. It's going to be, nitty gritty. Let's see what's going on and what we can do to help, and that can bring about a lot of stress. As the bottom last item touches on, overexposure and compassion fatigue are common when that is laid on a counselor, like it would be in that type of situation. And sometimes the stories and experiences that are expressed to the counselor can connect to their own trauma or what they've been exposed to in different situations as well. So there's a lot to understand about potential impact on counselors working in this type of crisis situation. So what can a counselor do to help themselves? What kind of self-care techniques can they engage in? Breathing activities, just like we would ask our clients to explore, that can be done by the counselor too. Safe place imagery, if there's an ability to take breaks, by all means do so. And during those breaks, perhaps engage in calming activities, reading, meditation, music. Maybe speak with family members who are not there back home. Kind of normalize situation. Life is still okay, even though it's different where I'm at now. And then I think it's important also to share experience with other counselors working in the field with you. What are they experiencing? What are you experiencing? And just share that. And if possible, if at the end of the day or at some time there can be a group debriefing, I think that could be helpful as well. So you want to help in a natural disaster? How can you? Well, the American Red Cross is the agency everyone points to. There's a link here to their volunteer site, which is very comprehensive, and it talks about mental health assistance and how you can be trained to do that, and the training that's provided there. All my readings indicate that it's a real robust program that they have. So that's a way that you can get involved in this if you're interested. This slide here is just a knowledge base, a lot of different sites and sources that you might look at if you want to learn more about how to respond to natural disasters and help survivors in that situation. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions or comments, particularly positive ones, be sure to hit me up. Thanks.